university. Similarly with the journal. The article is part of a journal, but that journal is published by a particular organization. And maybe some of the metadata about that organization, which is also in the record for that article, isn't metadata about the article itself. It's metadata about NISO, right? The fact that NISO is in Baltimore is information about the publisher of the journal article. So this is kind of what we mean when we're talking about data modeling. You understand what the things in your universe are, and then you start stitching those together by using URIs to identify those things, and then hanging more and more and more and more metadata off of this. So this was what linked open data was all about. When Tim Berners-Lee wrote this design note for the W3C back in 2007, it kind of, to me, changed the game because it moved semantic web away from all of this AI stuff for many of us and towards these simple principles of naming things with URIs, URLs basically. I mean, http://. And then enabling people to look up those names of things and get back information about what the thing is. Get back information about Paris. Get back information about Corey. Get back information about metadata. And then link to other URIs that other people are using to describe related things so that you get this web of data that people can crawl and agents can crawl and look at and harvest from through what is often referred to as the follow your nose principle. Just kind of going through and following these links and traversing things. The really nice stuff about this, and what's important about this to me, is because it thinks about metadata as a graph. It thinks about not just sets of records that you might put into a system to index and search on, but rather about relationships between all of the things that are relevant to your domain that you would like to describe. And you type them, and you track those relationships, and you allow the ability for others to take your graph and your metadata and very easily merge it with metadata that they have, and recombine these things in interesting ways that are dependent on the application being designed, that are dependent on the use case. So when these principles came out, the picture of how much linked data was in the world kind of looked like that thing on the left. There were maybe 7 or 10 sources of data. Within the next year, it had become that thing on the right. And then a year later, it kind of looked like this. And you'll notice that at the middle of all of this is something called Wikipedia, which I'll be talking about shortly. And then Tim Berners-Lee gave a TED Talk in 2009, at which, if you've never seen Tim Berners-Lee or watched this TED Talk, I recommend checking it out because he is so energetic and kind of a little bit crazy and fun to watch. But at one point, towards the end of this talk, he is literally jumping up and down on stage screaming, "Raw data now." He's just chanting at people to publish their data. And they listen. So here's 2010, how much data is in this thing. And here's 2011, how much data is in this thing. I've sworn to myself I'm going to stop using these graphs because they don't actually mean that much. The relationships between these circles and the amount of data that's there, it's artificially constrained. It's limited by the way the graph is generated. But it's still a nice picture of how much data is around. And you'll get a copy of these slides later, I think. And when you're looking at the latest version of this, every one of those bubbles is a link that you can go and actually explore the data set that's on the other end of it. One of the things that's interesting here, we back up a little bit to these earlier versions. Yeah, it's this one, the 2009 one. Up towards the top left, you see something called Libris. That's the Union Catalog of the National Library of Sweden. That is the first spot of library data that showed up on this diagram of linked data sources. Now, you probably can't see the legend down in the corner there, but the third circle down, and I'm colorblind and they all look the same anyway, but it says publications. It is this whole section of the graph in the top right there is library metadata and data from publishers and data about publications. And still, at the center of that is something called DBpedia. So I was talking a little bit earlier about data modeling and what data models are all about. And I think DBpedia is an amazing example of this. Because what DBpedia is an attempt by a bunch of computer science researchers in Germany to extract structured metadata from Wiki, from all the multiple languages of Wikipedias, and keep track of things like from musical artists, genres, and influences, and links to external data sets, and what bands people were in, and what books they wrote, and all this other useful stuff that is in the text of an encyclopedia. What's cool about it is the way they designed their ontology. They built out a view of the universe that was represented in Wikipedia based on what are called info box templates, which are, I'll show you them, a couple of them in a second, but they're the convention used in Wikipedia for creating and editing Wikipedia articles. So essentially, you're taking the metadata entry format for the articles themselves and turning it into an ontology, building a structure of classes, types of things about it, and then building a metadata vocabulary that applies to those types of things. And in the process, they came up with 3.4 million kinds of things that were described in DBpedia. 1.5 million of those are classified. They have formal types of things. There's about 50,000 metadata properties there, and about 1,200 of them are formally defined in the DBpedia ontology. So this is an example of, just to give you a sense of the scope of the info box templates for this stuff, these are the 57 templates that fit in the category music, I think just music, or musical something. And you've got templates for albums, and anthems, and hymns, and guitar models, and discographies, and bands, and singles, and records, and so on and so forth. And what they look like is a set of metadata elements that are relevant to, for example, an individual musician, birth date, an alias, birth names, backgrounds, pictures of them, where they're from, what bands they're associated with. This looks right familiar because it corresponds directly to the section of Wikipedia that's in that box, that info box, when you're looking at a Wikipedia page. So they basically mined this for their metadata. And they created then the ability to extract huge amounts of factual data, or hopefully factual data, about people, places, and things that they've then published as linked data, which creates sort of a hub that all of these other data sets out there can link to and work with. So then logically begs the question, what kinds of things are in library data? And I think the answer is that library data is ridiculously complicated. I don't expect you to be able to see that. I made that graph years ago, basically by taking a MARC record, turning it into mods, running it through a sample mods RDFizer to generate RDF, and then visualizing it through an RDF viewer to see what entities were getting defined there, what things were described, publishers, places, topics, subjects, cross-references on those subjects, the book itself, so on and so forth. And it's this big, huge, complicated mess. But there's important stuff in there. And it's no more complicated than the 50,000 properties and 1.5 million types of classified things that are in DBpedia. So I'm now going to move a little bit into talking about library metadata itself and why I think our metadata is so important to this landscape. For one thing, we've been curating our data carefully for much longer than any of us in this room have been around, right? We have rich, controlled, structured vocabularies about it. We have subject headings, thesaurus, code lists, classification schemes. We're starting to see the beginnings of data models in things like Ferber and the Bibliographic Framework Initiative. And we've got a lot of useful vocabularies floating around, buried in our various metadata specifications. So a few years ago, the W3C formed an incubator group. It's a W3C label for groups that essentially look at particular topics and try to tease out semantic web or web useful things that are in them. The W3C is the World Wide Web Consortium University. Similarly with the journal. The article is part of a journal, but that journal is published by a particular organization. And maybe some of the metadata about that organization, which is also in the record for that article, isn't metadata about the article itself. It's metadata about NISO, right? The fact that NISO is in Baltimore is information about the publisher of the journal article. So this is kind of what we mean when we're talking about data modeling. You understand what the things in your universe are, and then you start stitching those together by using URIs to identify those things, and then hanging more and more and more and more metadata off of So this was what linked open data was all about. When Tim Berners-Lee wrote this design note for the W3C back in 2007, it kind of, to me, changed the game because it moved semantic web away from all of this AI stuff for many of us and towards these simple principles of naming things with URLs basically. I mean, http:// and then enabling people to look up those names of things and get back information about what the thing is. Get back information about Paris, get back information about Corey, get back information about metadata. And then link to other URIs that other people are using to describe related things so that you get this web of data that people can crawl and agents can crawl and look at and harvest from through what is often referred to as the follow your nose principle. Just kind of going through and following these links and traversing things. The really nice stuff about this, and what's important about this to me, is because it thinks about metadata as a graph. It thinks about not just sets of records that you might put into a system to index and search on, but rather about relationships between all of the things that are relevant to your domain that you would like to describe. And you type them, and you track those relationships, and you allow the ability for others to take your graph and your metadata and very easily merge it with metadata that they have, and recombine these things in interesting ways that are dependent on the application being designed, that are dependent on the use case. So when these principles came out, the picture of how much linked data was in the world kind of looked like that thing on the left. There were maybe 7 or 10 sources of data. Within the next year, it had become that thing on the right. And then a year later, it kind of looked like this. And you'll notice that at the middle of all of this is something called Wikipedia, which I'll be talking about shortly. And then Tim Berners-Lee gave a TED Talk in 2009, at which, if you've never seen Tim Berners-Lee or watched this TED Talk, I recommend checking it out because he is so energetic and kind of a little bit crazy and fun to watch. But at one point, towards the end of this talk, he is literally jumping up and down on stage screaming, "Raw data now." He's just chanting at people to publish their data. And they listen. So here's 2010, how much data is in this thing. And here's 2011, how much data is in this thing. I've sworn to myself I'm going to stop using these graphs because they don't actually mean that much. The relationships between these circles and the amount of data that's there, it's artificially constrained, it's limited by the way the graph is generated, but it's still a nice picture of how much data is around. And you'll get a copy of these slides later, I think. And when you're looking at the latest version of this, every one of those bubbles is a link that you can go and actually explore the data set that's on the other end of it. One of the things that's interesting here, if we back up a little bit to these earlier versions, yeah, it's this one, the 2009 one. Up towards the top left, you see something called Libris. That's the Union Catalog of the National Library of Sweden. That is the first spot of library data that showed up on this diagram of linked data sources. Now, you probably can't see the legend down in the corner there, but the third circle down, and I'm colorblind and they all look the same anyway, but it says publications. It is this whole section of the graph in the top right there is library metadata and data from publishers and data about publications. And still, at the center of that is something called DBpedia. So I was talking a little bit earlier about data modeling and what data models are all about. And I think DBpedia is an amazing example of this. Because what DBpedia is an attempt by a bunch of computer science researchers in Germany to extract structured metadata from Wikipedia, from all the multiple languages of Wikipedias, and keep track of things like from musical artists, genres, and influences, and links to external data sets, and what bands people were in, and what books they wrote, and all this other useful stuff that is in the text of an encyclopedia. What's cool about it is the way they designed their ontology. They built out a view of the universe that was represented in Wikipedia based on what are called infobox templates, which are, I'll show you them, a couple of them in a second, but they're the convention used in Wikipedia for creating and editing Wikipedia articles. So essentially, you're taking the metadata entry format for the articles themselves and turning it into an ontology, building a structure of classes, types of things about it, and then building a metadata vocabulary that applies to those types of things. And in the process, they came up with 3.4 million kinds of things that were described in DBpedia. 1.5 million of those are classified. They have formal types of things. There's about 50,000 metadata properties there, and about 1,200 of them are formally defined in the DBpedia ontology. So this is an example of, just to give you a sense of the scope of the info box templates for this stuff, these are the 57 templates that fit in the category music, I think just music, or musical something. And you've got templates for albums, and anthems, and hymns, and guitar models, and discographies, and bands, and singles, and records, and so on and so forth. And what they look like is a set of metadata elements that are relevant to, for example, an individual musician, a birth date, an alias, birth names, backgrounds, pictures of them, where they're from, what bands they're associated with. This looks right familiar because it corresponds directly to the section of Wikipedia that's in that box, that info box, when you're looking at a Wikipedia page. So they basically mined this for their metadata. And they created then the ability to extract huge amounts of factual data, or hopefully factual data, about people, places, and things that they've then published as linked data, which creates sort of a hub that all of these other data sets out there can link to and work with. So then logically begs the question, what kinds of things are in library data? And I think the answer is that library data is ridiculously complicated. I don't expect you to be able to see that. I made that graph years ago, basically by taking a MARC record, turning it into mods, running it through a sample mods RDFizer to generate RDF, and then visualizing it through an RDF viewer to see what entities were getting defined there, what things were described, publishers, places, topics, subjects, cross-references on those subjects, the book itself, so on and so forth. And it's this big, huge, complicated mess. But there's important stuff in there. And it's no more complicated than the 50,000 properties and 1.5 million types of classified things that are in DBpedia. So I'm now going to move a little bit into talking about library metadata itself and why I think our metadata is so important to this landscape. For one thing, we've been curating our data carefully for much longer than any of us in this room have been around, right? We have rich, structured vocabularies about it. We have subject headings, thesaurized code list, classification schemes. We're starting to see the beginnings of data models in things like Ferber and the Bibliographic Framework Initiative. And we've got a lot of useful vocabularies floating around, buried in our various metadata specifications. So a few years ago, the W3C formed an incubator group. It's a W3C label for groups that essentially look at particular topics and try to tease out semantic web or web useful things that are in them. The W3C is the World Wide Web Consortium, if you don't know. And this incubator group for linked library data collected and curated 50-some-odd use cases from throughout the community, things that people were either actively doing with library data in this space or wanted to actively do in this space. And they were using that to try to come up with some functional requirements and design patterns around publishing linked data for libraries on the web. Again, this is around the time that Tim Berners-Lee had been in front of a group of people at a TED Talk, jumping up and down and screaming, raw data now. Give me your data, please. We'll work with it. We'll do something with it. This should eventually lead to working groups. It's already led to a couple of initial working groups and community groups within the W3C. But what's interesting are the categories for these use cases. Bibliographic data and authority data, archives and heterogeneous data, which is a weird glomming, but given that like almost all the metadata being talked about in all of these spaces is heterogeneous. But still, that archives component is important because it's not traditionally library stuff. Digital object metadata, collection metadata, and so forth. So authority data is the one I want to focus on for a second. Because if you look at that principle of linked data, include links to other URIs so that people can find more stuff. Aside from assigning URIs to our authority records, this is what authority data is for. It's for collocating things. It's for enabling people to browse and navigate structures of topics and understand what resources are available about that. And they've been around for a long time, and people trust them, people want them. I've got a couple seconds, so I'll tell an anecdote about authority data and the importance of it. How many of you have heard of id.loc.gov? The linked data service from the Library of Congress. It publishes all of Library of Congress subject headings as linked data. When they initially put it up, it wasn't actually the Library of Congress putting it up. It was an employee of the Library of Congress who was doing it on the weekends and in his free time, basically in his garage. And it had the URI lcsh.info. He had just registered this domain and started converting Library of Congress subject headings to linked data and putting them on the web. People started using them. And people were really excited. People outside of libraries were really excited to have access to the library community's categorization of the world. But the Library of Congress didn't like that this was published outside of their domain. So they pulled it down, or they asked him to pull it down. Took it offline, said we're going to try to do this in a more formal and professional capacity down the road. So the individual replaced the service with a blog post that said, I've been asked to take this offline. Hopefully it will get replaced by something more official soon. Within 9 hours of that blog post getting put there, the second comment on it was from Sir Tim Berners-Lee himself saying, can I help? Is there a way we can get this data back? The people who are building the web really, really, really want it. I like that anecdote because it illustrates how darn important this metadata is to people, not just in libraries. These controlled vocabularies are amazing, amazing. I think they're the most valuable resource we have. I'll get into a little bit later in my talk why I think we're actually slowly killing them. But they're comprehensive, they cover a lot of space, and they work with this thing called SCOS. SCOS stands for the Simple Knowledge Organization System, and it's the way you represent controlled vocabularies in linked data. Basically what you're doing is saying, I've got this subject, it's a concept, it has these attributes. It's got attributes like preferred label, and alternative label, and source, and date entered on file, and what authority file it's from. And you can then use that in linked data to be nodes in these graphs, so that you can take advantage of things like cross-references, browsing broader and narrower terms, the kind of things we've typically done in our OPACs. So that's the subject example. We do the same thing for names. And this names problem is a huge, hard problem that everybody on the web grapples with. And we have great names metadata. And it's getting better. There's a thing called a virtual international authority file, which hooks together name authority data from national libraries all over the world and presents a SCOS representation of that data that has all of the different scripts and languages, different labels and preferred labels and alternative labels. So what can you do with that? Well, this is a project from some friends of mine in Belgium, hence the Belgians with an exclamation point at the top, called Free Your Metadata. It's a product called, well, it's now called Open Refine. It used to be called Google Refine. That is essentially, it's been described as Microsoft Excel on steroids. It's a really, really, really powerful spreadsheet-like tool for reconciling and managing data. And these folks have made a whole bunch of tutorials on how to use that to connect data sources from different places, organize them, navigate them, and understand what's going on. So I've been playing around with that on and off. I did one experiment with our institutional repository at New York University. I took all the free text names that were in it that are not really under authority control. They don't have cross-references. The indexes aren't enriched by additional versions of those names, and wanted to see what I could find with Refine. So most of our researchers probably aren't in the LC name authority file, so I didn't necessarily start there. I actually started with some reconciliation against DBpedia to find out if I could find metadata from Wikipedia about the people who are publishing at New York University. And I actually had some pretty good luck. And it was fairly straightforward to do this. I found there's a professor at the Stern School of Business, where I'm actually a student now as well. And his Wikipedia page definitely was a match to him. And now suddenly I have alternate forms of his name, and I have information about him, and I can identify him in systems by a URI rather than by a name, which makes it easier to unambiguously know who we're talking about, and to be able to incorporate other metadata about the individual into the systems we're working with. So that's just one little tiny example of what you can do with this stuff. I'm going to pause now to see if there are any questions on linked data in general, the principles, the library applications of it, and now I'll move on into what LODLAM is all about and why I think that's pretty darn cool. You guys no questions so far? Good, good, good. Okay, so when Stephen asked me to come talk here, he had asked me to give a presentation on linked library data, because that's normally what I give presentations about. But I think the real value in linked data for libraries is not necessarily just in library data. A couple of years ago, there was something called the First International Summit on Linked Open Data for Libraries, Archives, and Museums in San Francisco. It's put together by a guy named John Voss, who works for something called History Bit. John's awesome. He gives presentations about this stuff that are far more exciting than mine are. But he was bringing together librarians and archivists and museums and curators of collections from around the world, people from the British Library, people from the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, people from the Louvre, people from the Library of Congress, people from scholarly organizations, New York University, pulling all of this stuff together to talk about how we can get our metadata across lots of different cultural heritage sector organizations to play together more effectively and more nicely. He talked about, it was very much an unconference. It was kind of just like a group of about 120, 130 people sitting around for 3 days just talking about stuff and sharing ideas and sharing projects and getting help with each other, writing some code here and there. We talked a lot about Europeana, which is a European-funded project to pull together archival and museum and library metadata from across the European Union and present it in a seamless front-end user interface. Also according to linked data principles, so that you can easily then add to it and annotate it and build on it and reuse it in different places. We talked about something called LOCA, the Linked Open Co-Pack and Archives Hub project out of the UK. That takes bibliographic data and archival data and again tries to model it according to these graph-based principles so that it can be more easily be worked with and used and reused. Liam, I'm not sure why I put Liam on this slide. Liam is a grant that I'm involved in out of Tufts University for linked archival metadata. Quoting from their grant perspectives, planning for the application of linked data approaches to archival description. I put this on this slide because people in archives are also interested in this stuff and working with libraries and working with other cultural heritage organizations to try to present cultural heritage information more effectively on the web. Europeana, I mentioned, is aggregation of cultural heritage objects from throughout Europe. They're creating linked data for institutions. I think it's one of the things that's cool about this. They have people who are working with institutions who don't have the capacity to generate this stuff themselves to help them get that online. They've got a pretty robust and well put together data model. And they've got these neat interfaces for putting together virtual exhibitions that the institutions can then build. And I'll show you an example of that in a bit. Similarly, I mentioned the Linked Open Co-Pack Archives Hub, or LOCA, finding aids from over 200 institutions throughout the UK. And again, modeling this data as RDF, making it more reusable, and trying to create an environment where it can be worked with in innovative and interesting ways. So all that's well and good. It's interesting to me that one of the recommendations of the W3C incubator group was to start experimenting with services. Try to understand the use cases for linked data. Because so far it's all been about publishing. That comes up in a successor project to LOCA as well. Working with data to bring together, working with multiple institutions to bring together data from all over the place is a laudable goal in and of itself, but we need to see what can be done with this and what the actual benefits are to end users. Emmanuel Gomez put this really well at the Dublin Core Conference in, I think it was 2010. No, it was 2009 in Berlin. She was basically saying it's not just about publishing your data anymore. Try to think about the actual uses for end users. So this mad mantra of publish, maybe we have enough data out there now. Let's start doing stuff with it. Let's start making sense of it. So there's a lot of places where that's going on, and I'm going to run through a bunch of examples of them very quickly. I don't know if I'm going to try to follow any of these out to the links onto the internet and play with them. Sort of depends on time and how things are going. See here, I've been talking about 35 minutes, 30 minutes, a little less than halfway through my slides. Yeah, I may follow a few links. Sorry, I probably should have just done all that in my head. So, you may be able to guess that I like Bob Dylan. I use him as an example a lot. But this is an example of something called ThinkBase, which is built on what's called Freebase. I was showing you Google Refine before. Google Refine was originally a Freebase product called GridWorks. Google then turned around and bought Freebase because Google was actually starting to really think about what it meant to try to provide structured data and make sense out of structured data on the web. But this Australian or New Zealand group designed this thing called ThinkBase, which mines Freebase for data and then presents visualizations of relationships between the entities in there. So whenever you see user interfaces around linked data, initially interfaces like these are really quite popular because they're nice visualizations of the spread and of relationships, but they're not really good end user interfaces. They're nice visualization tools, but they don't quite get us where we're trying to go. Despite that, Google saw some value in Freebase, bought it, and incorporated it into something that they call Google's knowledge graph now. So in the past year, you may have noticed that when you do Google searches for known entities, you start getting metadata about those entities in the right-hand column of your search results. That's all coming from structured data. It's actually coming from Freebase mostly, to an extent from DBpedia, from a few other places. There's a recent initiative that I wanted to talk about somewhere during this talk, but I don't know if I'll have time to or not, called schema.org, which is essentially a collaboration between the big major search engines, Bing, Yahoo, and Google, to look at how to present structured metadata in web pages in a way that search engines are going to be able to harvest and make use of. An example that I don't have a slide for that was where Google actually started some of this work was in Google recipe search. I don't know if any of you have noticed, actually, let's see if I can find an example. Let's look for something like enchiladas. Nope. Are they not doing it now? Apples? Sometimes, and you never know when this is going to happen or not, you'll get some left-hand navigation on your Google page that gives you the ability to kind of say, if there's not like a recipe search somewhere now.
Yeah, it's right by, yeah.
Ah, yeah. But still, no. Oh well. Thanks, Google, for failing me. The idea is you should be able to filter recipes based on what ingredients go into them, what cooking times are going to look like, how the kinds of things that we fasten on in our own systems and libraries should be available in search interfaces. And they started rolling this out a year or so ago, and apparently have stopped rolling it out, at least in some contests. Or maybe they're doing A/B searching and you get it sometimes and you don't get it other times. It's drawn from structured data that's embedded in the markup of the web pages that Google indexes. So what they're doing is basically building an ontology called schema.org to say, here's how you describe things that are important to your web content if you're a web publisher. Go at it. Put this stuff in there, and we'll leverage that in trying to present a more effective search interface to your data based on that metadata that you're providing. I'm involved in some work through the W3C that's being spearheaded by Richard Wallace at OCLC, called the Schema.org Bibliographic Extensions Working Group. The idea is Schema.org is allowing specific communities to design extensions to that vocabulary that are relevant to their domain, to help people in those communities publish data in a way that is going to be most effective to search engines. They've done this already for newspapers, newspaper articles. They've done it for e-commerce with an organization called Good Relations that was doing RDF metadata for prices and products, basically. They're doing it with us in the library community, and they're doing it in a variety of other spaces to try to build the ability to publish rich structured data that's going to be useful to web pages. There we go. Again, another example of this. Did I skip one? Yeah, I skipped RelFinder. RelFinder is one of my favorites. Again, it's one of these sort of kitschy visualization type projects, but it gives you the ability to take any two nouns you're interested in and start a crawl of all the linked data that's known to the visual data web people to see how those entities are related to each other and to navigate the paths between them. And so here I'm demoing a pretty obvious example. Bob Dylan and the band were pretty tight throughout the history of their performing careers. But it's interesting to see what happens with this with less well-known connections and to find out, it's kind of like the 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon thing, but with all the metadata that is published according to these sets of guidelines for publishing data. So something similar happening out of Pratt University in New York is called Linked Jazz. And this has, basically they're publishing linked data about a variety of different jazz artists and the jazz scene in general. This is just one of their applications, their sort of network application, but you can hone in on any node in this, Miles Davis, and see who he performed with, see who he recorded with, read some info about him, follow the links from place to place, and try to then understand who these people are. Turn it around so that it focuses in on particular people. And it presents a way of navigating this data in a really interesting way. Now, I'm still not convinced that this is the answer to how best to present this stuff to end users, but I do think it's pretty slick. And I think it's a useful illustration of what's possible. Back to European, I mentioned the virtual exhibits before. Again, with the data they're harvesting from all these different places, they give museums the ability to build out rich sets of exhibits about their collections. The point of all of this, a point that I stole from Jane Stevenson, who's involved in both the LOCA project and its predecessor project, Linking Lives, is that all of this stuff relies on the quality of the metadata that comes in. It relies on how that metadata is modeled and managed. It relies on the structures in it and the vocabularies that are used within that metadata. You can start putting this stuff on maps. You can put it on timelines. You can do some tremendously cool stuff with it if you have good metadata to start with. More examples. Social networks of archival context. So I've recently been trying to shift away from libraries and more towards archival work. In the archival community, their main descriptive standard is called EAD, Encoded Archival Description. It's basically TEI repurposed to work with marking up archival finding lists, which were traditionally like binder-thick descriptions of archival collections. Well, now there's a thing called EAC, or Encoded Archival Context, which is being used to pull information about people, organizations, families, names, entities out of EAD records and build essentially authority records for these things. Then there's a project being jointly done between the University of Virginia and the California Digital Library, a couple of other organizations, called Social Networks of Archival Context. This has been jokingly referred to by a bunch of people who are on the inside that are working on this project as Facebook for dead people. The reason for this is because buried in these archival descriptions, archival collections are rich collections of narrative about people's lives, their correspondence. There's boxes of letters. Those boxes of letters often include access points that say who those letters are to and from. If you start pulling these context records out of EAD records and building a database of them, you can start to see that John von Neumann had correspondence with all of these various individuals. Kurt Gödel, who would have known that? You can then follow that link to a finding aid for Kurt Gödel's papers somewhere. You can see the relationships from both ends of these things because these famous people's papers are held in archives throughout our country. It's really powerful stuff to be able to visualize and understand and navigate these relationships. This is similar to what Linking Lives is trying to do. This is, I mentioned before, this is a successor project to this linked open COPAC thing in the UK. They're building a UI that mines those relationships between the people in their finding aids, but then enriches them with data from places like DBpedia and Freebase to grab things like pictures and to grab additional citations and references and additional information about these folks. There was something called Link Sailor that is one of my favorite examples, and unfortunately it doesn't work anymore. Link Sailor, the reason it doesn't work anymore is because Talus, the company, the semantic web company, stopped doing linked data business. They're just an educational software provider. So they took down something called the Talus platform. This was an example application built on the Talus platform that, again, crawled 80, 90, 100 different sources of linked data and tried to follow these links of relationships that said this URI represents the same person as this URI represents the same person as this URI to present a UI that keeps track of personal information of these people, their families, their locations associated with their lives, the creative works that they were involved in, and pulls all that into one user interface in one place, on the fly in real time. It's a really cool example, and I wish it was not gone. This is another neat example. I like this example in part because the blog post describing this example, was done by some consultants, Bijan Parsia and Kendall Clark, I think his name is. They wrote a blog post a few years ago called Another Reason the Semantic Web Kicks Ass. What they were doing is dealing with large amounts of data from a lot of different places, basically. They took the data dumps that RPI, the Rensselaer Polytech Institute in upstate New York, made of RDF from all the data.gov open data that was published by the US government. So data about government agencies and about grants and about all these other things that the US government is up to. And all that data was made available because it should be available. I mean, it's technically ours, right? And some folks at RPI worked it into RDF so it could be worked with in somewhat useful ways. And what Clark and Parsia did is build a simple UI on top of it that enables you to kind of say, okay, I want to see things related to the Department of Agriculture. Immediately they grab the Wikipedia article for the Department of Agriculture because they've hooked this into DBpedia and are using that as their name authority control. And you can go through the topics associated with this. And again, attempts at reconciling these against DBpedia articles. And you can go through particular data sets. And then for any one of those, the data sets are categorized by LC subject headings. So you click on one of those, and it's immediately pulling in a WorldCat search of all the books that are about that topic. So this is a really useful sort of proof of concept of how researchers can start from a portal to US government data and navigate around and find their way to books that are relevant to the data set they're looking for. And what's cool about this is they said they were able to hack it together in a couple of hours. Because linked data is published in such a way that it's fairly easy to make use of it. You don't have to learn new APIs. You don't have to learn a new metadata format every time you encounter a new data source. There's starting to be tools that enable us to play with this stuff ourselves. I highly recommend checking out ViewShare. It's a project from the Library of Congress. It's done by an organization called Zafira that the Library of Congress has hired to do a lot of various different things for them. It's built on an old MIT stack called Simile. But the idea is basically you register for a free account, and you can upload a spreadsheet, and you can do a little bit of reconciliation. It's not as powerful as OpenRefine, but you can also take your spreadsheet and really crank on it in something like Refine and get like your place names converted to actual lat-long values and get your dates normalized and managed, and then load it up into an interface that enables you to do faceted browse of it. It enables you to do useful searching. It enables you to like generate charts based on the distribution of pieces of data in it, put your data on timelines, put it on maps. These got out of order sometime. It enables you to do things like this. This is a project called opencontext.org. These are indexes of archaeological sites and collections of things, stuff, bones and pottery shards found in the ground throughout the world. And these folks that are working with Stanford are building a linked data-based database of all of these archaeological things, mapping it and reconciling it, cranking on it with OpenRefine, just like I was saying, and then loading it into something very similar to ViewShare. That enables you to like look at timeline at the top and map at the bottom, projects, digs basically, and see where various pieces of archaeology are coming from. Which is a quick, nice segue into the last sort of third of my talk. The Linked Ancient World Metadata Institute, or LODLAM. I had the opportunity to be involved in this thing last year, and I'll get to do so again this year. And it completely blew my mind. It was amazing. This was a collection of the world's archaeologists and numismatists and classicists. And I like saying the word numismatists, so I'm going to say it again. They're coin collecting people, right? They're kind of on the edges of the digital humanities. They don't really consider themselves part of the digital humanities, but they really kind of are. I mean, they're archaeology, and they're people who are doing what's called computational archaeology. They've been doing it for a long time, I guess. But they're starting to do their own linked data. They're doing stuff like this open context thing. They're doing, one of the amazing projects they have going on is this thing called Pleiades. It's ancient place name net data, right? So you think our authority control is hard? Names and names of places? Well, imagine when the geographic coordinates of the place that you're trying to describe change depending on when you're talking about, right? And so the spot where you dug up that hoard of coins is a different spot depending on when the coins are from. It's part of a different country depending on when the coins are from. So they're actually using the principles of linked data to manage the relationships between these places and the empires that control them and the civilizations that were there and the time periods in a project called Pleiades, which kind of looks like this. It enables you to view maps of data and look at the geographical coordinates of things and look at various names that have been associated with it over time and when they were used and what they were used for and which major archaeological collections around the world have relevant data about these things. This was just mind-blowing to me. And what was even more mind-blowing is that these folks invited me to come talk to them as part of this 3-day NEH-funded institute that they ran to help learn how to do this stuff even better. And they want library data. They want libraries' help. I was telling them about VIAF a little bit, and they were like, their jaws were dropping. They were so excited about this international multi-language name database, basically. They want this stuff. People outside of our communities are wanting this stuff. And this is one of the things that's really important to me about linked data and leads to some of the research that I've gotten myself into over the last 6 months or so. I learned a new word from these numismatists, prosopography, another word I like to say. And I like to say numismatists and prosopography in the same sentence because it's fun. It's a study of a group of people. It's the study. It's the process of learning about a group of people based on the biographical studies of individuals that are part of that group. So, it's about context. It's about people's stories. This is why I think archives are increasingly important, because it's about people's narratives. It's about their lives. It's about who they were. This is what brings us knowledge. This is how we grow as cultures, by sharing our narratives, by explaining who we are and what made us who we are, and creating works that build on that and cement that. And it's not just about the stories of the libraries and the archives, but it's about users. It's about scholars. It's about people. A friend of mine gave a really compelling lightning talk last week at Code for Lit about the role of emotion in archives and why we avoid thinking about it, why we talk about archives as if they are these like stale, very dry collections, when the materials in them are people's lives, their romances, their loves, their disappointments, their tragedies are all in these boxes of materials. How come that doesn't find its way into our discovery environments? How come that doesn't make it into our systems? How come we don't treat that as just as important as the scholarship that somebody happened to create, or what they did as a business person, right? All of that is metadata. All of it is context. And it's all out there. So as we move towards being able to collect metadata from the whole graph and grab pieces of things from almost anywhere, it becomes really significant that we're in what my friend Diane Hillman calls an era of perpetual metadata heterogeneity. Our metadata is not one standard to rule them out all anymore. It doesn't work that way. Or Jen Riley points this out really beautifully in her Seeing Standards metadata universe presentation. It's this big, and I can still barely read it. It talks about all the different kinds of metadata standards and what they are and what they're used for and when they might be important. How do we bring all of this stuff together? Particularly when it's not even just about libraries anymore. It's about libraries and archives and museums, but it's not even just about libraries, archives, and museums anymore. It's about archaeologists and classicists, and I'm not going to say that word again. But they want our data. They want us to be able to publish data for them, and we want to be able to use data from different places in our own tools. So one of the things I think is really important for people to take away from this talk is that there's something called the open versus closed world assumption in the semantic web community. Closed world basically means that the patterns and semantics and values of your metadata are known. You know your universe. You work with your universe. Open world is basically saying, I don't know what my metadata is going to be. I get new metadata every day, and it's from a new organization that I've never seen before. Let's try to agree on a set of principles for describing that metadata effectively. The W3C has this self-describing documents page. This is what RDF is about. This is what the principles of linked data are about, making it easier to continually integrate different metadata from different places. Most library systems currently are closed world. They're the silos that we often talk about, right? But then again, almost every metadata system is closed world. I mean, even Google, in a way, is a closed world universe. Google builds builds their indexes according to what they want that data to look like. And they filter it, and they massage it, and they manage it, and they change it. But they're integrating data from lots of different places. So they're trying to learn how to incorporate open world metadata into their systems. In open world metadata, there's no such thing as like, if your record, so to speak, doesn't say that like Corey Harper wrote Hamlet, that doesn't mean that's not true in an open world assumption. That means that no data that we have has said that that is explicitly not true. There's a subtle difference there. The assumption is, I don't know anything more than what I have in my system. And that doesn't say that any other assertions or statements about resources aren't valid. It just says that here are the things I know, and then maybe there's other stuff out around the edges of that that I slowly will learn and know as I explore more and more and more. But open world metadata requires context, right? We need to know why it matters. We need to know whose metadata it is. And our authority control systems provide a lot of that context, and yet we've been killing them because the interfaces to them are ridiculous. Browse interfaces in OPACs. This is what we were trying to get rid of in the library community when we came out with this idea of a next generation library catalog, right? But does a next generation library catalog make use of authority control? You ever see cross-references in your single search box library search engine thingamajigger? You see them on Google? No, you really don't. But Browse is not a good UI design. It doesn't mean that much to people, particularly in the context of the web, and particularly when you assume open world, and there are no real edges to your metadata. So how do we make use of this kind of rich data in authority control systems, both within libraries and outside of libraries? And this is what my research has been of late. I'm trying to really understand what it means to build user interfaces that use this stuff effectively. I think I've got about 15 minutes left to show you this stuff before I break for Q&A. My premise was pretty simple. It was that we've got lots of metadata records of different kinds. We've got EAD, we've got MARC, we've got Dublin Core. We've got these software as a service, cloud-based linked data collections of authority data in things like VIOF and ID.loc.gov and SNAP, which I was talking about before, and DBpedia, which I was talking about before. We've got various other kinds of metadata that we may just store internally in any number of different ways. And they're all in these different closed systems. I've started trying to use RDF as sort of a normalizer to knit together the relationships between the resources that are in these different objects and try to dump it all into a single new kind of library discovery system. So I set some very careful scope on what I was doing, playing with a project that I've been colloquially calling linked open communism. And the reason for that is because NYU's Tamiment Library and Wagner Labor Archives was recently given, about 3 years ago, given the entire history of the US Communist Party, the records of that organization. Like the photo, we have a 400-page EAD finding aid of the photo morgue of the communist daily newspaper, The Daily Worker. That is incredibly rich, powerful, cool stuff. I want to disaggregate that. I want to start not thinking about these monolithic giant finding aids, but break it up into collections and then components, series, sub-series, folders. Treat those all like resources. Creating a broad set of resource types, right, classes. Model this stuff. Pull key entities out. People, places, topics, corporate bodies. I talked about this stuff at Code for Live, and people joked about the fact that I was naming names. I was kind of helping McCarthy out. I don't think he actually cares anymore, but if he did, maybe I would be getting people into trouble, except for they're in these records, and the records are on the web anyway, right? I wanted to throw it all in black and white. I wanted to put a Solr-based search interfaces on top of it, and then I wanted to put other kinds of metadata into that. So I built it, and I started playing with it, and like looking at how it works. And here you've got a search for transit workers, right? And you'll see right off the bat that you've got a lot of different facets. You've got this top-level format facet that has files, the sort of low-level thing in archival collections, the archival collections themselves. books and unknowns and serials. Those are from MARC records. Items from the archival collections. Corporations. Now that's an interesting thing, right? You normally don't see a corporation show up in a search interface. But if you run that fill facet, you'll see things like, oh wait, we've got the Transport Workers Union of America, which is an access point on one of these finding aids, excuse me, and is an access point in a lot of these MARC records. But it also has a Wikipedia article, so it's got DBpedia data. So I was doing reconciliation of my entities, the 1,600 or so things that were represented, no, more than that, I've lost track of the numbers, the 7,000 or so things that were represented as access points on my 1,600 finding aids. And I started pulling abstracts from Wikipedia into my search engine, and including those in the indexes alongside indexes about the collections and about books and about materials. A colleague of mine, an archivist from Princeton, made a really astute observation when I was telling her about this project. She said that my insight is that people are interested in understanding the things, the people, the places, the events that our resources are about. They are not interested in backing into those topics through discovery of a book or a folder or a collection. All of that stuff, we've got it turned upside down. The focal point of our discovery environments is all about the book. And the subject of that book, whether it be a person, place, or thing, plays second fiddle the whole time. That's why we don't really leverage those authority-controlled vocabularies anymore. Currently, this system only runs on my laptop. I'm looking for ways to actually ramp this up. I did this during a 3-month leave, a sabbatical leave from NYU last fall. I was out of the office from September 24th till the end of the year. And I spent that time basically turning 1,600 finding aids into close to 3.9 million RDF triples, about 385,000 components, series, sub-series collections, and 7,000 entity records. But I'll run a couple of example searches on here that I think are kind of neat. You do a search for something like the Coalition for Free Elections, right? You'll see a corporate entity there, and that one actually didn't get Wikipedia enrichment. I'm still working on debugging pieces of these things. You'll see files, you'll see a variety of other stuff. If you go to the format and you go and say, oh, I just want to look at the collections, right? Okay, well now what's this thing? Right, that's not the one I'm looking for. That's the one I'm looking for. Here's some random person's papers, right? He's a longtime New York State and later National Legislative Political Action Director for the Communist Party. This is from the abstract of the finding aid itself. But you get down into the entities related to him, and in addition to, what was the thing I initially searched for? Yeah, Coalition for Free Elections. And you'll see it here. That's why he came across here. But you'll also see other organizations and other people. You can find out Richard Lee Winger, right? So here's where I've got a record for Richard Winger in here that includes the abstract of his biography from Wikipedia. So this is all indexed now. And I have information about what collections he's related to in what finding aids at NYU. I've got links through to the DBpedia entry for him directly. I probably should change these links so they go to the Wikipedia page instead of the DBpedia entry, but I think you still get the point here. Another example is the Civil Rights Congress, right, which is an organization. Well, here now we can follow that link and then we can start reading about the Civil Rights Congress. So the search interface is starting to provide some of the context to the materials in the native environment where a person is doing research. You can fire through a related search to that Civil Rights Congress, filter out on format, oh wow, here are 35 books from NYU's collection that use that entry point, that organization as an access point on that material. So I think this is the kind of interface that we need to see more of. I love the idea, and I think what I was trying to do is fairly important, to be able to give people information about the topics that they're researching alongside of the materials that they're researching, irrespective of what format those materials are in. There we go. I won't bother talking about Gadget. It's one of the tools I use to help build that, but I'll talk a little bit about my technology stack for this. The front end is just almost fully vanilla blacklight. The Blacklight project started at the University of Virginia. Now it's largely Virginia, Stanford, some other folks. It's an open source Rails app that provides a front end to an arbitrary Solr index. Solr then is the indexing tool. The back end is Python using a lot of RDFlib, some forstore and HTTP forstore, which is an RDF library for talking to forstore, which manages all of my triples and helps me aggregate data from different places. I use a Python library called Sunbird for writing to Solr. I use an awesome thing I found called Fuzzy Wuzzy, which I have a slide about in a second, and a bunch of other Python modules. If any of you care, my code's on GitHub, and you can find it there. But Fuzzy Wuzzy, Fuzzy Wuzzy it's essentially a fuzzy matching toolkit for Python. And what's neat, it was developed by these guys called, at a corporation called SeatGeek. I don't know if any of you have ever used SeatGeek, but SeatGeek is a meta search engine for finding event tickets. So they're searching across event databases and ticket resellers all over the world. And they discovered they had a problem that's very similar to the problem that I had. That you could get lots of different variations on names of events in these disparate databases. And so they wanted to try to normalize them. They wanted to try to algorithmically score the similarities between arbitrary strings to find out whether they are close enough to each other, like New York Knicks spelled out, VS, Brooklyn Nets, or NY Knicks versus spelled out Brooklyn Nets. Like the distance between those two strings isn't super far. And you can use math to try to understand how closely similar strings are in order to say, oh yeah, I should treat them as the same string. And that's what I've been doing between access points in my archival collections through Library of Congress and DBpedia handles. I've got a diagram of data flow, which probably doesn't even need to be there. And some future steps on this. There's a lot of code that I have written that I still need to incorporate. I don't know if any of you are archivists or really familiar with archival metadata, but one of the things that I was playing with is usually access points at an archival collection are at the collection level. They're at the very top of everything. And yet, going back to this slide I just said I didn't care about, I'm treating those collections as first-class objects in my system. I'm also treating every single component in the system as a top-level object. So every folder, every series, every sub-series, every sub-collection, those don't get their access points. But again, using Fuzzy Wuzzy string matching, I was able to, for about 10% of the 385,000 components that were in my 1,600 resources, I was able to, based on the unit title of that series, match them to an access point from the collection level. So I was basically able to say that, like, it's a little abstract without an example, but say there's a person who's in an access point for a collection about an organization. Why is that person there? You can't assume that that person's name is associated with every single series in that finding game. But there's got to be a box somewhere that has a bunch of that guy's stuff in it. So what I was hoping is that those boxes, those series, those units, would have that guy's name in the title of that component. And if I find close enough matches between the access point and the component, I can make the component inherit the access point from the collection, so that it also gets into my indexes on the back end. There's a bunch of other stuff I want to do. I don't need to get into that right now, but a couple of examples of where this is hard. These are examples of, in each pair, the LC subject heading is on the top, and through some digging, the DBpedia, Wikipedia representation of that same entity is on the bottom. So the textile workers strike in Gastonia, North Carolina in 1929 is the Lorry Mill strike. I actually want to talk to some friends of mine who work with NACO to find out what it would take to be like, hey, I think the DBpedia, the Wikipedia headings probably should be cross-references on the name authority records so that we can do this kind of matching more effectively. As it stands, I'm planning on just having override files in my code that are specific to the application. Other sort of next development type stuff. I want to work more EAC into what I'm doing. I want to tweak the relevancy ranking of Solar. I want to build an annotation interface. I want to enable other people who are users of this system to correct things into it, or to add information to it, or to tell their own stories about these resources, to add to the narratives that are in this data. I want to test it with other data sets, and to that end, I'm about to partner with, I'm working with NYU, NYPL, the New York Public Library, and an organization called the Metropolitan New York Library Council, which is essentially a consortia of New York libraries. We've got some seed money to start development on and have identified some initial outreach partners on a system similar to this for the history of the city of New York. And we're going to be working with like the Brooklyn Historical Society and the Museum of Natural History in New York and the New York Historical Society and NYU and the New York Public Library and the New York Transit Museum, I hope. And some of these other archival collections. I think the Metropolitan Opera might be involved in this. Places that have these rich metadata collections about the history of New York. Pulling those access points out of it and building the entity records for people, places, and things, and building an interface like this across cultural heritage institutions in New York in general. Not just derived from finding aids, but also derived from their content DM databases, or derived from their random FileMaker Pro or Access databases, or the spreadsheets they have describing the digital collections that they barely were able to digitize based on like some grant funding they got somewhere, right? They talk a lot about linked data. These folks are interested in linked data, but they don't have the infrastructure components to build this stuff. One of the things I didn't get into is the challenge of minting the URIs that we talk about as being the really important identifiers to use for these things in your metadata. It's expensive, and it's not an easy process. It takes some expertise. It takes some technical know-how. So we're looking at building a system that essentially would enable a couple of large institutions like us to do this work on behalf of smaller institutions throughout our community. And we're planning on applying for a grant for it in this next grant funding cycle. So hopefully, if you see me like in a year or 2 years from now, I'll have a really big version of what I just did. That's not just about the history of labor in the US, but it's about the history of New York City as a whole. Again, so where does this go, and why is it important? For me, I think what I've been trying to do is rethink the way libraries, archives, and museums user interfaces are designed. I think we've been doing our scholars and our friends and our colleagues a disservice by basically locking up rich, valuable metadata in really lousy user interfaces. And as a result, librarians are often very upset that like their user base is turning to Google instead of them. To which my reply is, well, why don't you build something that's half as good as what Google does, right? And then I wanted to think a bit about what's important about the data that we have. And the more I think about it, the more I think for the library and archival and museum community, the answer is context. So I'd like to see more of this stuff happening. And some of it's going to be happening. There's another LODLAM summit coming in Montreal this summer. There's another LODLAM coming this summer too, the archaeologist folks. People are doing this stuff, and I hope that we keep talking to each other and looking at how to do this stuff better and playing with it. But I think I'm onto something with this. And with that, I'm going to wrap things up with about 10 minutes left for questions. That's my contact information if you don't feel like asking a question now and you want to follow up with me later. Thanks a lot, folks. Somebody's got to have a question. Otherwise, I'll just sit up here playing with random sample searches in my linked communism user interface. See what I come up with. This is the example I used during code for the, I don't even know who this guy is. This is why people accuse me of naming names. Hey, let's turn off the book facet. That's better. Indeed, they're a person. Although this is actually the senior, there is a junior as well. So this is the wrong metadata, but you can see I actually have both of his subject headings in here. So maybe the senior gets talked about somewhere as well as the junior. But from this thing, you can go and have a look at something like the Arthur Landis papers, which was a U.S. volunteer in the Spanish Civil War. And people who were working with Spain during the time of the Spanish Civil War are really well represented in TAMWAG, in the Wagner Labor Archives and TAMWAG Library. But you can find other people who were involved in this stuff from here, and you can learn things about them, right? You can, it's a good example here. Wolf Milton, I don't even know who that is. He's another American veteran of the Spanish Civil War. He was working with something called the Lincoln Battalion. I don't know what that is, but maybe as a user we want to learn more about that, and we want to do a search on it. And we see that we have lots of books and various other things, but maybe we want to take a look at what corporations look like that. Hey, what's the Abraham Lincoln Brigade? Oh, wow. There was a whole group of U.S. volunteers who served in the Spanish Civil War, and they named themselves, and they were full of all of, like, we have all this documentation about them. You can see that there are dozens of collections at TAMWAG that are associated with this stuff. And you can go basically to any of these and find out what the papers are, what the collection is. This is kind of the idea of this, is that you can explore a domain, you can explore an area, and you can learn more about it as well as learning what resources might be associated with it. Yeah.
I have one question. I'm not sure if this is going to be very articulate or make sense, but you talked about kind of reconciling or matching names of organizations, so forth. Were there any issues came up with the property names that maybe they deal with the relationships, like who's the creator, author, whatever?
Yeah. So most of the reconciling I've been doing so far is against more authority-based data, and I just kind of cherry-picked properties that seemed relevant to what was going on, but I have not done a real ontology for this. I sort of halfway pulled one together for the archival metadata itself, and looking at properties to describe those access points. And then I know the implicit data model in Mark well enough to work with that too, and then looking at how all of that fits into Solr. I think that as something like this gets bigger, it becomes a lot harder to manage those property names, and I think it does become important to have a sort of an ontology that describes your domain in the context of your application, and then to do the ontology reconciliation, right? The vocabulary reconciliation and mapping and management downstream. And there aren't good ways to do that yet. Some of us in the Dublin core community are really actively trying to figure out how that stuff works, but it's pretty open-ended research question right now. It's a non-answer to your question.
Yeah, no, that's...
It's a hard piece. I bypassed it by kind of plugging my ears and pretending it wasn't there.
Do you have any reservation to use Wikipedia as a primary source?
Personally, I don't. I understand that a lot of people are skeptical about it, and a lot of people are concerned about the pedigree of the data that's in there. I labeled it where it's come from. I know where it comes from, and I trust that community to avoid vandalism, to very quickly police and remove like lies and propaganda that show up in there. I think overall studies have shown that it's a pretty unbiased, although not always particularly clean set of data. And I don't think there's anything else like it. I wish there were other sources of abstracts for people. I wish we'd been providing that in our subject headings and controlled vocabularies in the library world for as long as possible. I think this is one of the really promising things about EAC and that social networks and archival context, is that it pulls the family and personal biographies out of the EAD records and essentially matches them into the name authority records for those same people. Then that could then get folded into VOP, so we could get a librarian created. But again, that introduces a chunk of bias too. I mean, it's all about context, right? So authority records generated by the Tamman Library have a particular bent to them, so to speak, right? They come with a particular perspective. I don't know. I don't have any problems with using it. I can see why people would object to it, though I don't agree with them.
Corey, I have a question about context. You know, today, a little earlier, I was talking about context in several occasions. So I'm not sure how you incorporate context into this interface. Do you mean the context of an institution that you do this interface for? Or the context of the user in his or her searching session? Or just...
Right now, neither. I mean, this is where I was talking about annotations. I would love to have the ability for people who are interacting with this to add additional metadata, but we're not there yet. In this case, when I'm talking about context, I'm literally talking about, like, this is Fred Schaaf's papers. Fred Schaaf's papers mention the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. What is the Abraham Lincoln Brigade? That information usually isn't in, a lot of times it's not in an EAD record. It's almost never in a MARC record. It's not in an authority record for the Abraham Lincoln Brigade either. So when I'm talking about context, I'm talking about what is the organization? What was the, what was my example back here? Right, what was this treaty of non-aggression between Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939? What happened in Gastonia, North Carolina in 1929? You know, what prompted this strike? What was the story behind that strike? Who was involved in it? Why were they involved in it? That's what I mean by context. It's the narratives and stories that are implicit in the subject headings of our materials, but never make their way into the indexes. So you can't incorporate them into search.
So it's the Torah and you're looking at the Talmud sort of creating.
Yes, yes, I had to think about that, sorry. But yeah, I think so, because the Talmud is the scholarship about the Talmud, right?
Commentary,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Does that answer? Does that speak to what you were asking about?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking of a completely different meaning of context.
The meaning of context varies depending on context, doesn't it?